It looks like this is probably the crew that we're going to have here. So thank you so much for joining us today, John. This is some representation from the PARCS group. Not everyone could make it today, unfortunately, but I think we have a pretty good showing. And then we have one faculty, Jeff Halo, here. So we that he made it as well. So John, I sent out a bunch of emails to the group, so they have the information that you sent us, but I'll just say that John is the founder and director of the PUP Consortium that I'm sure he will tell us about here, and he has decades of work experience in protected areas and heritage management, and so we're really looking forward to hearing from you today, John. So I'll let you introduce yourself however you'd like, and take it away.
Okay, I see, since we're informal here, I see one person on my far left with just a boot. I don't know if that person could come into view. Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, she has to dip out a little early. Yeah, she didn't want to be rude.
That's the strategy. All right, now I know. And the person next to Jeff, I don't know if there's any way to scoot a little bit more inward. If not, yeah.
Yeah. Should I pull it? Oh yeah, come get cozy. There we go.
If we're going pretty informal, although I feel like I should be sitting in a chair with you guys, I feel like I'm, well, 3,000 miles away.
Well, we wish that you were here with us. And I have to ask, where are you right now? I don't actually know.
This is outside of San Jose, Costa Rica.
Okay.
Yeah, this is my house and my my studio, so to speak. There we go.
Good, I like the backdrop.
Thanks. Try to keep things interesting here. So you want me to introduce myself first? I could do that. Well, I'll just assume you don't know much and start from there. That my name is Jon Kohl. I'm the director of the PUP Global Heritage Consortium, an organization whose mission it is to transform the global paradigm in heritage management and planning to something more holistic than what we have largely today throughout the world. I live in Costa Rica because I was a Peace Corps volunteer here many years ago at the National Zoo, and married a Costa Rican, and I guess I eventually married the whole country, so to speak, and here I am. I'll give a little bit more about me during the talk as well. So, and I guess because of the informality, we certainly can talk afterwards as well. But let's get started here and see if I can do the switching back and forth between the screen, because the screen really, my PowerPoint really isn't that important compared to me, I hope. So anyway, I'd like to start by having us all imagine that we are in Mainz, Germany, some 600 years ago, and it's February 9th, just like it is here, and it's quite cold in Germany. I don't know, what's the temperature in Clemson right now, outside?
50, 55-ish.
Oh, okay, that's not too bad. Well, it's colder than that in Mainz, Germany, 600 years ago, which I'm sure you can imagine. And before us, if you can imagine, there's a big door, and this is the workshop for Johannes Gutenberg, you know, the famous creator of the Gutenberg Bibles. So let's go into the shop and take a look around, see what we can see. You just imagine we open the door, we walk in, and the first thing that we feel is the warmth from the fireplace, the hearth. Then we hear a banging noise, boom, 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 boom. And this banging are the typesetters who are forming these these lead forms that will be the letters that are used to put on the printing press. And in the center of the room, you will see the famous Gutenberg printing press with two gentlemen standing next to them. One is the typesetter, and he's the one who's taking these lead forms and putting them on a plate in the order that we'd like the letters and the words to appear on a page. And the other is a pressman. And the pressman grabs this large lever made out of wood, pulls it down and lowers a plate. And on the underside of this plate is watermarked paper imported from Italy. And as it's lowered, it comes up against the letter forms, which has the ink, as you can actually smell a certain varnish in the air that they use from a lamp varnish. And then when he pulls the lever back up, the sheet pulls up and the words are printed on that sheet. So then they take that sheet and they pass it over to another part of the workshop where the illuminators are. And the illuminators are the men, we'll say women, I don't really know, and they do the painting of the letters and all of the decorations. I'm sure most of you have seen pictures of the Gutenberg Bible with the fancy letters with multiple colors, and the decorations that go up and down the margins. And then once the illuminators are done doing their painting, they pass it to the other side of the workshop, and there are the binders. And the binders take this pig's cord, and they sew all the pages together into this perfect permanent binding. So then we have, voila, one of the Gutenberg Bibles. Perfect binding, hardcover, sequential pages, high investment in graphic design, and all of these characteristics together make it so that this Bible, this book, can never be updated. Which for Gutenberg, that was fine because he was quite sure God wouldn't change his mind. But for us, 600 years later, we're still using the same publishing paradigm. 600 years later, when we make our plans, got one here right here, we still have this perfect binding and sequential pages and investment in graphic design. And just like the Bible, this plan from Tikal National Park cannot easily be updated because of this format. So this old idea that we're still using for publishing combines with other old ideas, some of them outdated, some of them were never valid. They combine to make it nearly impossible to implement and update our plans. And now, even though today in this world we don't enjoy that same certainty that Gutenberg had, matter of fact, you may have heard of the Yiddish proverb that says, "Man plans and God laughs." Yet we still use the same technology that he did. So in effect, what we're seeing with our park plans is that we have a global silent crisis of non-implementation all around the world. It's really not just restricted to parks. It happens to affect all sectors of society, whether it's education or government, nonprofits. But since our battlefield is parks, and of course many parks are battlefields, I will give examples primarily from the parks world. I say it's silent because in our field of heritage and parks, very few people, if anyone, has studied non-implementation of plans. In other fields, there has been some studying, but in our field, practically nothing. So how do we know that there's a global crisis? Well, I use 3 pieces of evidence. One is a study that you might know from 2010. It was a management effectiveness study, and it looked at natural protected areas all around the world and found that only 30% of natural protected areas around the world were actually managed effectively, and the other 70% obviously not. And one of the main reasons they weren't was because of a lack of implementation of plans. Another data point that we could use comes from Art Peterson. Art Peterson is the founding director of the Sustainable Tourism Program of the World Heritage Center of UNESCO. So he's a man who's got a very global view of protected areas, especially with respect to tourism. And he observed that most World Heritage sites, surprisingly, don't even have tourism management plans, but of those who do, almost none of them actually implement those plans. A third source of evidence we could use, and actually I find this the most convincing, perhaps the least scientific, but the most convincing, is in the 18 years that I've been working on this question about non-implementation of park plans. I've talked to a lot of planners and managers, and I've never found one who denied the possibility that this crisis exists, who denied the possibility that there aren't many partially or completely unimplemented plans across our planning landscape. So this is potentially a very big problem that affects all of us, and not just as professionals, but as individuals. I mean, I don't know how many of you guys are listers, and I don't mean bird listers, but you wake up in the morning like I do, and you write up a list of things you plan on doing today. I mean, it could be on paper, it could be mental. And then surprisingly, at the end of the day, you find that several of those items are still on your list and you haven't completed them. So how is it that if we can't even complete our daily plans, imagine implementing the complexity, the plans of national parks, for example, with all the complexity that they have to deal with. So to try and answer this question or to solve this problem of non-implementation, it's really important for heritage, for protected areas, and for all of us. I mean, we really need to get down to the roots and not just use superficial explanations. You know, when you ask managers and planners so often, why didn't that plan get implemented? Oftentimes they'll say, well, lack of resources. But I'm going to propose to you all that it's not a lack of resources. It's more a lack of new ideas. So what I want to show and share with you guys today is why we still plan for a world that doesn't exist. Let me say that again. We are making plans for a world that does not exist. So I'm going to take you on a 15-year journey, obviously in a much more reduced period of time than that, that correlates to my professional development and some of the stories that I encountered along the way and the lessons learned that came out of that, that explain why so often our paper plans, once they hit the real world, end up on shelves so frequently. So this all started in Honduras. Let's see if I can do this quickly, around Pico Bonito National Park. I worked for a nonprofit organization then called Rare Center for Tropical Conservation, today just called Rare. Some of you may have heard of it. And we were on the north coast of Honduras working with several different national parks in nature guide training. And Pico Bonito National Park, second highest peak in the country, was one of our partners. So one day I was in the office and the president of Pico Bonito comes up to me and he says, "John, we just got $5,000 to create a public use plan, but we don't know how to do that. Can you recommend a methodology or a consultant to help us?" Nobody here is Honduran, so you don't know how bad my accent is. And I said to Fito, "Well, we don't do that, but we're an ecotourism development, grassroots development organization, but we're partners, so we can do a sort of a non-scientific survey and see what's out there." So I consulted with colleagues and consulted with literature that we had there and consulted with the internet, and many of you might not be old enough to know, but in 1998 there really wasn't much of an internet to consult. But what I did find through those different consultations is not something, a person or a methodology that we could recommend to Fito. Rather, it found a Latin American landscape full of park management plans, partially and completely unimplemented. Dead and dying, you might say. All different kinds. Financial plans, conservation plans, protection plans, general management plans, visitor management plans. They're all suffering the same ailment. So I came back and said, "Fito, we can't recommend anything, but because we're a grassroots ecotourism development, we do sort of participatory planning things, even though it's a small amount of money, it was only $5,000, believe it or not, we think that we could help you come up with something at least as good as that which is out there." So I went to my boss, Brett Jenks, who's now the CEO, and I said, "I'd like to do this." He said, "Fine, but I don't want to see more plans on shelves. Find out why plans don't get implemented, and you can do this." So I went back to Fito, and I said, "Okay, we'll do this based on two conditions. First condition is for you, the second one is for us. For you, the condition is you have to write your own plan." Because even back then we had this inkling that the way consultants were used for planning wasn't quite right. And then the condition that we put on ourselves is we would do the research to find out why plans don't get implemented. Because we had also this inkling that it wasn't simply a lack of resources that everyone seems to talk about. And that was the birth of public use planning of my program and then the organization, which I'll get back to you a little bit more about. So this was actually a pretty exciting moment for me. I was probably 27 years old. And it was a big question. Why do these plans not get implemented? But who was I to try and answer that big question? I mean, I had just graduated from graduate school, graduated from Yale Forestry. Maybe you guys could empathize with maybe how I felt in that moment. I wasn't even a planner. I had never studied planning. Yet the answer was so valuable potentially to students, to professionals, to parks across Latin America, and perhaps even parks across the world. Had to do this. Now, fortunately, soon thereafter, Rare teamed up with UNESCO on a project whose goal was to demonstrate that sustainable tourism could contribute to biodiversity conservation in World Heritage Sites. And over the next 3 years, Rare and UNESCO and a little bit of UNEP, we worked with 6 World Heritage Sites, 4 in Mesoamerica and 2 in Indonesia. So during these 3 years, I got to see a lot of plans, not just from the World Heritage Sites where we worked, but from other sites as well. And during this time, I began to see this sort of uncanny coincidence, if you will, between the behavior of plans and the behavior of scientific studies. That is, both of them seem to follow the same process in their development. For example, both begin typically with extraordinary funding, that is funding outside of your normal budget to do. Both have some kind of field research or data collection phase. Both go through an analysis of that data. Then both come up with conclusions, or in the case of a plan, prescriptions, management prescriptions. Then the plan is written up. It's peer reviewed in different cases, or not different cases, but in different kinds of peers. Then a final draft is produced, and then it's published. And in both cases, usually the authors hope somebody else implements the plan or the study. So what I began to see is that these technical management plans were really trying to emulate the scientific process. And it became clearer later on that these plans, which I'm going to call conventional plans, conventional planning, they also needed a certain kind of world in order for them to actually be effective, in order for them to actually generate real results on the ground. So this world, I would summarize, and I call it the plus world. And where plus, each of the letters refers to a characteristic of this world, and also because plus, like addition, is the simplest mathematical operation. So I'm going to ask you guys out there, what do you think the P might stand for in this plus world, the world that the planners need to exist for these plans to operate? Anyone have an idea?
Practical.
Practical? Okay. Well, actually, that's definitely not one. Not a bad guess. In a different world, practical would be important. Any other ideas?
Public.
Public? Well, actually, ironically enough, they definitely don't need to be public because they're typically done by technicians and scientists, oftentimes behind closed doors. Okay, I'll help you with this one. I'll give you another shot in the other letters. Predictable. Because if you think about it, a plan is only done every 5, maybe updated 10 years later. And I gave a talk like this at the National Park Service in Boston, and one planner yelled out, 15 years. So it's very infrequent. So you have to be able, in order to generate management prescriptions today, you have to assume that to some degree you can predict what the situation will be, what the park situation will be 5, 10, even 15 years into the future. So L in plus, now most people don't get this. I'll give you just 5 seconds. Anyone want to blurt out an L? No, okay. L would be linear. It's a way to simplify how the world is. Basically, one unit of problem, say poaching, can be counteracted or corrected by 1 unit of anti-poaching. That brings you back to equilibrium, which is I hear, a really nice place to be. I've never actually lived in equilibrium, but it sounds like a good place to shoot for. So by looking at problems in a linear fashion, it makes it much easier to create these kind of plans. The U. Sometimes people guess this one. What do you think the U is? You have to say it a little louder. Louder again. The wind is strong here in Costa Rica.
Universal.
Oh, universal. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting characteristic of this world. That's not the word I'm thinking of, but that's a good guess. Understandable. Did you just say that, Jess? Nice. So we have to assume the world, our conservation problems, our management problems are understandable, that we can understand with enough information the dimensionality of our problems enough to come up with prescriptions in the pretty short time we have to develop this plan. This idea really comes from Newton. Where Newton basically said if you take a tennis ball, well, he didn't say tennis ball, maybe an apple, but if you threw a tennis ball across a room and you have enough information about its trajectory, its speed, its velocity, and the materials, you can calculate where it'll end up. So there really is no limit to what we understand if we have enough information. And then the S in plus, this one's pretty easy.
Sustainable?
Oh, nope. It's still easy, even though people usually guess that one first. This is the old world. It's stable. That the conditions that we're living in today, in the moment of our planning, more or less will be the same conditions 5 or 10 years into the future. I mean, they really have to be if we're going to create this plan that we're not going to update for this period of time. So this is the plus world, and it's sort of like living in a laboratory. I mean, you may think of some of those horror movies where there's this terrible pathogen that's out there infecting the people and turning them into zombies, like I, Legend, or maybe World War Z, and they have these laboratories where, you probably have laboratories like this at Clemson, I'm sure you do. You walk in and you've got your fluorescent lights humming overhead, and your white walls, have little white walls here, temperature controlled, humidity controlled, everything is controlled. It's a well-behaved environment. And and this particular lab that I want to show you also has a shiny metal door that opens with a Star Trek-like swoosh that we're going to go through. As a matter of fact, would you guys like to go through that door with me to see what the real world looks like outside of this nice laboratory? Anybody want to go? You don't actually have to get up. So let's go. But before I open that door, let's look back into this laboratory to see the plans that are in this environment. You know, the plans are well adapted for this environment. Notice, as if I were to take an orchid from Costa Rica, and we have many of them here, and bring it up there to South Carolina during a colder day. You know, it wouldn't do too well outside, but if I were to put it in one of your greenhouses, I'm sure it would do fine. Matter of fact, you probably have some orchids from Costa Rica living fine in those laboratories, in those greenhouses, because they're adapted to the conditions. Maybe it's even the other way around. They create the conditions for the orchid. So that's the kind of plant that can live in this space. But if we go outside that laboratory, whoosh, we open that door, we find it's a very different world outside. All we have to do is look at the newspapers any day, and I actually forgot to look at the newspaper today, but safe to say that even a year ago, we couldn't have predicted how our government would be, the US government. I understand the woman there, or one of you are from Kenya, right? So I don't want to overgeneralize, but even, okay. But even the elections going on in Kenya over the last few months, you probably wouldn't have predicted the behavior of this system even 6 months ago, or maybe you would have. I don't want to put words in your mouth. But even in the United States, just look what happened in terms of climate. You know, what was it called? The bomb storm that went up the East Coast and dropped snow on my home. I'm from Massachusetts. The 2 hurricanes that did all that damage, the mudslides. I mean, these are things in this world we couldn't predict. A great deal of uncertainty. So this world is a different idea of what we call the dice world. And actually, I had a big die here, but I think my 5-year-old took it and brought it to his room when I wasn't watching. So anyway, you can imagine, you take a die and you roll it, and you don't know how it's going to come up, unless, of course, it's loaded. My dice aren't loaded. And that's more characteristic of this world. And of course, the letters of dice represent characteristics of the real world that we're living in, or at least that's how we perceive it. So the D, everyone gets the D, usually on the first try. What do you think D stands for in this world?
Dynamic.
Dynamic, exactly. The behaviors of systems here are definitely not linear. I mean, this is a world characterized by tipping points and thresholds and overshoots and crashes and discontinuous behavior. In short, non-linear. It's definitely the opposite of linear. The I of dice, which you won't guess, is impossible to completely understand. Very different from how Newton saw the world. If you might know, Heisenberg said just by observing phenomena, we can change them. And so often as we try to understand these systems, the closer we get to thinking we understand, either changes or we realize we actually never really understood because we discover questions we hadn't asked previously. So we have to live in this world without the certainty of being able to completely understand the systems that we need to manage in our protected areas. The C, that's an easy one.
Complex?
Yes, thank you very much. Complex, because there's lots of relationships, lots of variables in our systems, and every 2 variables has a relationship. And these relationships are characterized by emergent properties. Now, if I were to, I unfortunately only know, is Anna out there? One of you, Anna? No, she didn't come today? Okay. I'll have to use Jeff because Jeff, you're the only person whose first name I know. Now, if I were to take out a sword, and I need you as a volunteer, Jeff, it's only going to hurt for a little while, and I were to walk there, don't worry, there's 3,000 miles separating us. And in the name of science, which since you're a scientist, you perfectly can appreciate this, I were to cut you open and your organs were to fall onto the table, and I'm sure you have a very nice heart. I don't even know to cut you open to see that. If we were to study these organs, these parts, would we be able to surmise anything about Jeff's personality?
No.
No, exactly not, because his personality is an emergent property of the relationship, of the relationships of these parts. We cannot understand the whole by studying the parts. This is a key feature of complexity. Jeff, you can put your organs back in now. Thank you for volunteering. I'll put my sword away. So, and then the E, which you probably won't get, so I'll tell you that one. The E is ever-changing in short term and evolving over the long term. And as you see, the world is constantly changing. As a matter of fact, that change is accelerating, both culturally and scientifically, environmentally. And this is the world that Einstein tried to describe for us. It's the world of chaos theory and relativity and quantum mechanics, superstrings and super surprises, right? And this is all accelerating. This is the world that our plans have to survive in. This is the world they have to thrive in. And plus plans can't do that. So interestingly, when I was at Rare, I got to see this dice world in action. I mentioned to you that 2 out of the 6 World Heritage Sites that we worked in were in Indonesia. And I'm just going to show you those 2 where I worked. One of them was in Komodo National Park, World Heritage Site, where the Komodo dragons come from. And the other one is Ujung Kulon National Park. This is the home of the very endangered Javanese rhino. And it's also the park that long time ago was submerged by a tsunami when Krakatoa blew up. You can actually see, I think you can see what's left of Krakatoa Island from the shoreline of this particular place. So back then I was director of the public use planning program, hence the pup here. Or as my son liked to say, poop, you've got poop on the wall and poop on your shirt, he tells me. But in fact, it has another meaning. So we had some rare folks working, and Indonesians, working with the community, working with the parks, with the Nature Conservancy, and helping the Indonesians write their own, do their own planning process. They facilitate their own planning process. They wrote their own plans, because we don't write plans for people. And then the government actually approved those public use plans in both of these World Heritage Site national parks. So the communities and the parks, they were very excited. You know, they had actually written their own plan, they had facilitated their own plan, and it was approved, and they were ready for implementation. And then they looked to Rare, and Rare looks back, sorry, project's over, money ran out. You might be able to imagine how I felt, since I was in charge of that project. I was one who helped build up this expectations that implementation was going to come after this plan. And then I felt like we had turned our backs on them, and I really felt terrible. And it occurred to me that this was maybe the first lesson learned that I'm going to tell you about on this 15-year journey. And this first lesson learned is that just because you have a plan doesn't mean it'll be automatically implemented. Just because you don't have it doesn't mean it's automatically implemented. So anyway, when that project ended, that wasn't the only thing that ended. Also, my job, because I was being paid out of that project. So the project closed down. My first job came to a close, my security, my pay. And all I was left with was this one big question to why plans so often go unimplemented. And I didn't even have an organization to back me up anymore. As a matter of fact, I started to feel like I probably wouldn't work with a large establishment organization because the question is too far outside the box. And when I think of large establishment organizations, I especially think of the 3 big heritage organizations in the world, supranational heritage organizations. You guys know what those are? Who names World Heritage Sites? UNESCO. Who advises UNESCO for natural heritage? IUCN, exactly. Who advises UNESCO for built cultural heritage? You guys might not know this one as much, but anybody? Okay, ICOMOS, the International Council on Monuments. These are the three biggies that have worldwide memberships. So I saw ahead of me perhaps a lonely journey if I really wanted to take on this question. And when I lost my job, I have to admit, I was in no mood to dream about my future. So now I want to take a moment and ask you all a question. Think of a planning process or a plan that either you were involved in or that you knew about that led to partial or complete non-implementation that ended up on the shelf. I'm trying to think what a principal barrier was to its being implemented. I'm just going to give you a moment to come up with just one idea in your mind. Go ahead.
The requirements for implementation.
Sorry, can you say that louder?
The requirement for planning or compliance, but not for implementation.
Just whatever you consider a barrier for that plan not being implemented.
Lack of legal issues.
Oh, but don't tell me. It's your secret for the moment. Although, all right, what were you going to say? We'll use it since you have told us all anyway. Lack of what?
Legal requirements for implementation.
Okay. Hold that thought. Now, if I were to poll you, we probably, and there's not that many of you, we'd probably get a pretty decent size list of barriers. If this talk involved 15 or 20 people, we'd have even a more significant size list of barriers. And I actually had this opportunity to do just this poll for a study that I participated in 2006, funded by the Nature Conservancy and carried out by Katia University here in Costa Rica, where the idea was to study 5 national parks and their general management plans and to study barriers to implementation. So we asked a whole lot of planners and managers and stakeholders in each of these 5 parks to do precisely what I just asked you. What are the main barriers? And what we came up with was a list of 120 different barriers. Really long list, way too many for the methodology of the study that we had anticipated. So we needed to consolidate those into larger categories. And what we came up with was a list of 14 categories. And I'm going to share those with you right now. And as I share this list quickly, try to see if your ideas, like a lack of legal requirements, somehow fits into one of these categories. So we have management problems, maybe that's Jeff's, problems with the document itself, a lack of personnel, a lack of training, a lack of protected area staff ownership in the plan, economic barriers, planning problems, actor involvement, lack of political will, lack of empowerment of protected area directors, mental barriers, that's a pretty big one, unapproved plans, donor interests, lack of priorities within protected area. I'm not sure if Jeff falls squarely into one of those, but I imagine the variety of yours fall into one of those directly or indirectly. So this was not an exhaustive list, but we found it a really exhausting list. I mean, we knew about plus and dice, and we have this list, but none of this really tells us what the solutions are. How do we get around this crisis, this silent crisis of non-implementation? What kind of scientists would it require to get through this depressing list? And later that year, that scientist appeared to me in the form of Steve McCool. Now, one of you is from the University of Montana. Is that person here? Anyway, so you probably have all heard of him. You probably been forced to read articles by him anyway. And you probably know that Steve McCool, for 35 years, is a leading expert in protected wildlands planning and management, well known. He was actually hired as an external evaluator for our public use planning program back in 2001. So that's how I had originally met him. And I was complaining with him about the study results of all these different barriers. And then while I was talking to him, it occurred to me that I would ask him a question. And I said, Steve, is there any chance you'd be interested in writing a book with me? And then he said, yes. And I said, yes. Wow, this expert, world-renowned expert is going to write a book with me, this young field guy. This was the acknowledgement that I needed, the recognition, the support that I needed to work on this project. And it took us 10 years to come up with this book, which was published a little over a year ago. And I'm sure I wouldn't be here if it weren't for him and the support that he gave doing that. So while we were working on this book, starting in 2006, I was hired by UNESCO, because like I remember the public use planning program at RARE had been closed down, so I basically brought it with me, took it with me out of RARE, and I brought it to the World Heritage Center. The World Heritage Center, as you might remember, was the organization, or maybe I didn't tell you, that actually was funding our work with RARE back in the early 2000s. And Art Peterson, the guy who I cited at the beginning of this talk, was the director of that center. And he believed strongly that still this was a big problem in World Heritage Centers, and we had to figure out why plans, especially tourism plans, so often ended on the shelf. So since 2008, we visited a variety of different World Heritage sites around the world, where we got to test this methodology and improve this approach to public use planning with the goal of getting around implementation barriers. So I'm going to take you to some of those countries and see some of the lessons learned. And the first one we went to was Dormitor National Park in Montenegro, World Heritage Site. During World War II, this is where Tito and the partisans hid from the Nazis. And UNESCO wanted to do a public use plan for this park. One of the ministries was in agreement. Another ministry only wanted to do training, and the third ministry didn't want to do anything at all. So we did end up doing a little bit of training, and that was it, and then we left. And the lesson learned here is that if the stakeholders in a site don't align their vision and their objectives about what they want to do in a planning process, then there's no way they're going to participate in the implementation. And the different ministries were definitely not aligned in this particular case. So now let's jump over to 2010. We're going to go to Vietnam, where with UNESCO, we ended up working with 2 World Heritage Sites and a biosphere reserve. Now, as you probably know, Vietnam is one of 5 remaining communist countries in the world. Does anyone know the other 4? I want to mention one? Anyone? Anyone know? You only study the United States? Big ones participating in the Olympics today is North Korea. Then you have Cuba, not too far from here, Laos, and China. Anyway, what's typical of these communist countries is they're very centralized, top-down in terms of planning and many other aspects of management. But here I am in Misong Sanctuary on a sweltering hot day, and on that same day, there are stakeholders of this site who are very excited and enthusiastic. And they're excited and enthusiastic because this is the first time that they were able to plan in this Vietnamese park from the bottom up, from the grassroots up. They would never have been given that opportunity. It might be the first time in any Vietnamese protected area at that time in 2010. And the same thing happened in the 2 other sites that we worked at as well. I don't speak Vietnamese, so all we did was help them facilitate their own plans as they did in Indonesia. And all 3 plans ended up becoming approved by their respective governments. And the lesson learned here potentially is by devolving power to the lower levels, to a variety of stakeholders at the grassroots, and not just at the grassroots, they become more excited and more disposed, more likely to want to participate in the implementation. So now let's move on to a different part of the world again, back to Europe. Oh, sorry, before then, this was a publication that UNESCO did some year later where they're quoting the manager of the Biosphere Reserve. You can read the Vietnamese or the English, but just the last sentence, where he said, engaging different stakeholders in the planning process, the outcome may reflect the will of the majority. The will of the majority had not been reflected in Vietnam in protected areas prior to this, as far as we know. Now, jumping back to Europe, and we go to the city of Évora in Portugal. Évora is an ancient city in a lot of ways. This is where the Portuguese explorers first came up with their plan to go around the world. People like Vasco da Gama, Magellan, Henry the Navigator. And here we end up working with the municipality to create a public use plan for the historic district. And we actually developed a crack team led by the man second from the left, who is the director of the historic center. And with this team coming from all different aspects of the municipality, we went through about a third of what we anticipated the public use planning process would be, and then municipal elections. The mayor of this team didn't win the elections. In fact, the communists won, and the director of the historic center lost his job, and this project was erased from the annals of history. What's the lesson learned here? The lesson learned here is politics matter. And you're probably thinking, duh, but I tell you, no, not duh, because if you look at most of these management plans, whether they're public agencies in the United States or anywhere around the world, they're almost exclusively technical plans. There's no consideration of the politics, of cultural and social problems and idiosyncrasies of stakeholders, because in the plus world, those are considered confounding variables that just screw up our attempt to make technical, well-based prescriptions. So in that site, that was what we ended up having as an issue. Now to a more recent site. Here we are in Chagres National Park. Now this is in Panama. Before last year, when the Panama went to 2 lanes, the Panama Canal, it supplied some 40% of water for the original channel. Now, interesting, in this one, when we started work, even before we started working here, at the moment we saw the terms of reference in the contract, I knew that this plan probably would never be implemented. Long before we even started the planning, it was clear that this wouldn't be implemented. Why? How can I say that? I say that because when you look at terms of reference, you can see how power is being allocated. And in these terms of reference, they gave way too much power to the consultants. You know, me. You'd think I'd be pretty happy to have all that power. And they, in fact, they assigned me everything to do for my team, the research and the writing and the workshops and everything. So when it came time to ask other stakeholders to participate, including the director of the park, basically her attitude was, and I don't blame her, her attitude was, this is your project, you do it. Basically, you know, we'll do whatever we have to do so you can do your job. And there really wasn't much participation because everyone had that expectation that the consultants would do it. The lesson learned here is implementation doesn't begin when you have the plan finished. Matter of fact, implementation begins long before the planning actually starts. It even starts, implementation, you might argue, starts before you even have the terms of reference. As a matter of fact, implementation might begin in that very first moment that the idea to do a plan pops into somebody's mind. Because then in that first moment that that idea pops into their mind, that person starts configuring power. Well, maybe we'll need this donor and that agency and this consultant, and they could come up with this very top-down vision. Or they could say, well, before we make any decisions, let's go talk with the stakeholders and see what they want, which would be a different pathway that could lead to a different end. Of course, there's more than just 2 pathways. There's quite a few. But you can see where you can sort of predestine the outcome by how you distribute that power in that process. And that was a really important lesson that we've already applied in other sites. Then another recent one, going to the United States. This is Fire Island National Seashore, a National Park Service unit, Long Island. Not that far. Matter of fact, you guys, I think, have a similar national seashore in South Carolina or North Carolina. I forget what the name of it is. In any event, what we had here is myself and the Consensus Building Institute, another member of the consortium in Boston, we were the facilitators of this process. But there were some workshops where we, the facilitators, we didn't even go to the workshop. We didn't even facilitate because we had prepared the chief of interpretation and the assistant superintendent to facilitate their own workshops. So they were co-planning with us. And to do that, they had to have some training. They had to have some confidence building. They needed a number of different intangibles in order to make that happen. But ultimately, the lesson learned here is by having others participate in creating the plan itself, by co-owning it, they feel more ownership and more likelihood, more of a stake in its implementation. One final example, and this is a project that's sort of beginning now, so this isn't one that's already happened, because Fire Island finished last year. This is Mineral de Pozos. It's a site in Mexico, ruins of miners, a whole mining town in gold and silver. And what we did here is with our Mexican partner, we basically had a contact and we just sort of showed up. We had some meetings with the local property owners, with local businesses, local tourism folks, and had a dialogue. We had no money, we had no agenda, we had no project. And by having this dialogue, we came up with some idea that we thought would be good for us and would be good for them. And we co-created it without having the pressure of the biasing pressure of having money right over our head or having power and politics hanging over. Because as soon as you have those, they distort the relationships. You have the outsiders with the power and locals with no power, as so often happens. But in this case, we had no money. So their only interest was if they saw a mutual interest in doing this. As a matter of fact, next week, we will be having a meeting with them to set up our first sort of a site assessment trip. That's really in the happening. So let's stop sharing here. So if we take all these different examples, what is the message that's trying to emerge from all of these different examples across time? The sum or the synergy of these lessons learned. And it might be that the planning process itself contributes to the community's ability to implement. That it's not just producing a technical document, that it is contributing through working with the community to implementation. In other words, how we plan determines what we implement. I'll say that again. How we plan determines what we implement. Now, during all this time, while we're busy doing these field projects, don't forget we're still working on the book, Steve and I. And one thing that we're finding and discovering is that disciplines and fields all across the spectrum, all across human civilization, are grappling with the same challenges of the plus world, the same simplification of what really is the dice world. And by studying these different fields, we're discovering solutions that they come up with that are actually really useful for park planning, even though the park planning world may be largely ignorant of a lot of these things. So part of our mission was to bring these in, both through our book and through our work. And I want to share what some of the other fields are doing that are actually really potentially useful for park planning. And I got a list of things on here. The first one I want to talk about comes from the software development world. We actually learned a lot from software developers because they have this paradigm called the agile software paradigm. I don't know if there's anybody computer people here. But maybe the best way to explain it is through an example. Say some 15 years ago, a small company called Microsoft, you might have heard of it, came up with this product called Microsoft Word. Now, what do you think was the first version number of this program back then? Do you want to guess? The very first version, when they released it, was number what?
95.
What? No, it was 1, version 1, as it is with all software. They start out with version 1. Now, Microsoft could have made the decision, okay, computers don't do much. This is a pretty good program. Let's just leave it like this and move on to something else. But they didn't, because they knew the technology was evolving. They knew that the market was changing. They knew that they had a lot of bugs in the software that they had to squish. So they went and proceeded on to make version 2 and version 3. And here we are in 2018 with version, 16, I think, many versions later. So the agile software development argues for incremental and constant improvement through multiple versions. And this idea, this works perfectly, at least in theory, for plans that are trying to survive in a dice world. Because as the dice world changes, the plans have to adapt and change. You've all heard of adaptive management. And this paradigm exists, yet we don't apply it at all, almost at all, to our planning. So this is a great idea that we've adopted into our approach. From the grassroots development field, there's this idea of multiple forms of knowing. Now you probably know in these kind of plans here, there's really usually only one form of knowing, of knowledge that's allowed, and that's empirical scientific. Empirical scientific is important, the scientific process is very important, but there's many other ways to know the world. There's collective and intuitive, traditional, experiential, spiritual. These are all different ways to know the world. You would think that if we want to solve our conservation and our management problems, the better we understood the context through these multiple ways, the better our solutions would be, right? I mean, that's a good reason to pay heed to these other non-scientific ways of knowing. But the grassroots development people also point out another big benefit. A lot of the stakeholders that we work with, they don't work in scientific, empirical way. You take a farmer or a rancher outside of Yellowstone who doesn't like wolves. You know, they don't know how to set up a scientific study necessarily, but they are using traditional knowledge that's passed down from their parents, experiential knowledge through their own trial and error process. So you can also involve a lot of other stakeholders and give them a more meaningful part by involving their kind of knowledge, which in the plus world doesn't happen. And we have integral theory, which is a theory that says there's an interior and an exterior dimension to everything, and how those interior and exterior dimensions interact has a lot to do with development and implementation. Our whole book was set up using that theory. From the conflict resolution, dispute resolution field, the multi-stakeholder dialogues, trying to co-create win-win situations. You know, that works really well in parks. There's adaptive technologies. I mean, how many of you have, I can't see from here, but cell phones in your pockets? Probably a good number of you. And in those cell phones, you all have browsers. And those browsers allow us to go to different websites, right? Like this very famous website here. And that website is programmed in HTML largely. And the HTML language, what does it allow us to do? I mean, it's interactive, it's non-linear, it's multimedia, it's easily accessible, it's inexpensive to update. You can use it even if you don't have an internet connection. You can print it out. I mean, it's everything we would ever want in a living document. It's truly the opposite of Gutenberg's paradigm. My 5-year-old can now navigate on these web pages. He can't design it, but he can navigate. So if we have this technology, which does everything we would want to have an adaptive plan, all of us using it in our cell phones, why do we continue to make plans designed like this with a 600-year-old paradigm? Doesn't make a lot of sense. And then after that, we have adaptive co-management and organizational learning, high resilience organizing, systems thinking, spiritual mind. There's so many good ideas and paradigms in other fields that we could benefit in the park planning world that we just don't know about, that we need to bring in. So if you take the sum of these together, these different planning, different paradigms, Steve and I came up with what we consider a definition for what we call in the book holistic planning. I'm going to give you part of the definition here because it's kind of a long definition. Basically, we define holistic planning as a facilitated, continuous dialogue with heritage area constituencies designed eventually to construct a consensus about a desired evolving future. I know you're thinking, that's a real mouthful, and it is. So let me try to explain it in a different way. We live in a dice world that changes very quickly, where there's not much certainty, and we need to be able to adapt and reflect and learn quickly to survive in this world. Our plans need to be able to do that. And that's hard when our plans are designed as plus, with a plus world mentality. It's sort of similar to the story of, you might say, the dinosaurs. Now the dinosaurs, they lived in a stable world for some 200 million years. Humid, moist, and these conditions allowed the dinosaurs to diversify and grow big and fat. And because the conditions were fairly stable, they didn't need to evolve quickly, and they didn't. Until that fateful day, 65 million years ago, you all know the story, when the conditions changed very quickly. And when the conditions changed very quickly, the dinosaurs were in no position to evolve the way out of. Fortunately, the mammals were, because if they weren't, we wouldn't be here talking about that. And this is very similar to bureaucracies. Now, you're probably not going to believe me when I tell you, but for hundreds of years, bureaucracy was the most efficient form of government to move people and materials from one place to another. As a matter of fact, as proof of the success of bureaucracies, we can trace bureaucracies back to the Roman Empire, to the ancient Egyptians. Very effective. Until the modern era, when change starts to accelerate. And now we find bureaucracies don't have the ability to learn and adapt quickly. So like the dinosaurs, they're becoming increasingly ineffective. As Steve McCool says, looking back towards the planning world, the park planning world, decades ago, parks and park agencies had both the authority to plan for their protected areas and the resources and political power to implement those plans. Today, in the 2000s, while parks like the National Park Service still retains that authority to plan, they no longer have the resources, and the political power to implement usually lies outside of the parks. So not only does the political power lie outside of parks, and not only do they have fewer resources, but our problems are more complex, and there's more actors in the democratic forum demanding greater numbers of values from our protected areas. So little surprise that these plans don't get implemented. In order for them to get implemented then, and the National Park Service and others, like the Bureau of Land Management with their Planning 2.0, realize that they need to involve their communities. Not because it's the nice thing to do, although it is, but because it's the necessary thing to do. They need the resources from communities. They need ideas. They need political support. But of course, communities aren't just going to hand these things over to the government or to private agencies on a silver platter. They're going to want to see their ideas and their sweat in those plans, which means that they're going to have to be involved in the planning process. But stakeholder communities, and I don't mean just communities that live there physically next to a protected area, I mean the scientists and the different agencies of government and even tourists, they can't participate. I mean, it's not a natural thing. They can't just jump into a planning process and produce co-created plans. They need certain skills as a group. They need to know how to dialogue together. They need to know how to construct consensus visions together. They need to know how to build trust to manage their conflicts together. And many times the communities haven't worked together, or they have inherent long-standing conflicts, low levels of trust. So when are they going to develop these skills so that they can participate in the planning process, if not during the planning process itself? It's oftentimes the only opportunity that the stakeholder communities around a park can come together and develop these skills is during the actual process itself. So that brings us to a very important point, that planning, holistic planning, successful planning with implementation in mind, rests on 3 pillars. First, the plan has to have a reasonable level of technical quality, because if it's BS, obviously it's not going to go anywhere. We've seen plans like that. Second, the planning process has to invest in the stakeholder or the constituent community during the process itself, to give them the capacity, to motivate them, to bring them together and create a vision during this process itself. And then third, the process itself has to use a technology for the plan document itself that can be somewhat easily updatable. Because to update this kind of plan and to print out another 500 or 1,000, or even just to do the layout, oftentimes there isn't much budget to do that. These 3 pillars are necessary in the dice world. The dice world demands this of our plans. The dice world has no patience for plus worlds. The dice world is exclaiming in many different kinds of languages that how we plan determines what we implement. How we plan determines what we implement. And if we wait until the plan's already done to start thinking about how to implement, we've waited too long and it's too late. So these ideas, which are reflected in Steve and I's book, they're perhaps great for graduate students and academics and technical people who like to go a little deeper. But what's always been my concern is, and my biggest fear is, what if It doesn't get beyond that. What if these are just intellectual ideas batted around in academia? And I've sacrificed my opportunity to work with an establishment organization and have a nice big hefty salary and end up making no difference at all in the real world. So to avoid that actually happening, I need to mention that when I was working with UNESCO as in sort of an ad hoc project between 2008 and 2012, we had this major problem. And that major problem is all the places that we went, and I should say for gentlemen from Kenya, we also worked in Fort Jesus in Mombasa as part of our portfolio. The plans didn't get implemented. Even with our best of intentions, with our so-called enlightened perspective, the plans still, and they didn't get implemented because the projects were still formulated in Paris at the UNESCO headquarters. The donors were matched up with sites, were matched up with partners, and then we would come riding in on our white horse, so to speak, with the UNESCO symbol on our shield and a sack of gold, and we would ask sites if they wanted to participate. Of course, they'd always say yes, and there would never be enough money in the sack to actually do anything beyond the publication of the plan itself. So it occurred to me that we really needed a new platform beyond UNESCO that would enable us to negotiate more appropriate conditions for implementation. So in 2013, I founded the HUP Global Heritage Consortium as a nonprofit organization to do just that, whose mission, as I mentioned in the outset, is to transform this global paradigm that's everywhere in the world into a more holistic approach to try to implement holistic planning and not just talk about it. So before, while we had UNESCO to open doors in Vietnam and Montenegro and Portugal and Kenya, we didn't have UNESCO anymore to open doors. We needed to find a different door opener, if you will, and that was to form a membership organization that through our numbers and through our members, we could leverage opportunities in a world that still didn't want to hear this paradigm, that's still today moving in that direction, but has a long way to go before it reaches at least the vision of holistic planning. And with this global membership network, use all the tools available, education, training, webinars, on-the-ground projects that we can use for talks like this. We're working on developing a think tank to take on ideas that the conventional conservation community doesn't want to deal with or likes to ignore. Publications such as the book, monographs. Use all these different techniques that we can to try and move this vision, move this paradigm. And now I can say, 5 years later, that I don't feel alone with Steve in this pursuit. Like I felt when I lost my job at RARE back in 2003, that there are many other people who are joining the mission, including our own Jess sitting right here, who's a general member of HUP and helped organize this talk, that together we can spread this word that how we plan determines what we implement. And now in 2018, I finally feel like I'm ready to dream about the future and what that would look like. And for me, not thinking about politics, but my dream would involve the three big heritage organizations that I talked to you about, IUCN, ICOMOS, and UNESCO, publishing, emitting a new policy guidelines, new vision globally, something more holistic. Even though UNESCO has a lot of postmodern thinking that you can see in their charters, they still are very technical in what they demand of their plans. And that by having this new vision would cascade down to protected area systems around the world, which would cascade down to planners and managers at the site level, so that the planners and managers didn't feel obligated to just build technical plans. That in addition to having good technical plans, they also felt obligated or convinced to build stronger constituent communities to participate in the formulation of these plans and the implementation. So I always like to end by calling out a call of action to whoever is listening to join our network, help transform this paradigm as Jess did, as Steve McCool has done. And not just for heritage planning, although in our field that's most professional, but really for all planning. To learn more about holistic planning, read our book, and perhaps most of all, remember and implement the idea that how we plan determines what we implement. So thank you all for coming. And because this is informal, I don't know how much time you have, but I'm available for questions and discussions. Just if you could move close to the microphone, if you have.
Sure. Well, thank you. Really appreciate that. So I had scheduled this for about 12:30 to 1:30, so people might need to head out.
Okay, yeah.
I just wanted to open the floor to let people do that if they want to. But if people have time, then we can stay and do a little Q&A if there are any questions.
Or just tell me your reactions. You know, for this kind of audience, but in other audiences where we have people who've been working in the field for 30 years and they're very invested in the old paradigm. You know, their publications are based in the old, their recognitions, their tenure at universities depends on old paradigms. You know, they're not necessarily willing to change, which is what's really remarkable about Steve McCool, that at the end of his career, he looked back and said, I participated in too many failed plans. You know, and he, at the end of his career, looked for a new approach forward, which is more typical of young folks and people who are outside the field. So anyway, my point is, if you have, share your reactions as well.
I have two questions. I have two questions for you. I'll take them one at a time. I'll get a little closer so you can hear me.
Excellent.
So,
thanks.
My first question kind of involves a bit of a story here where both Jess and I are working to help planning around polar bear viewing in the Arctic Refuge. And one of the issues there is not a lack of desire to engage the community, but the community's lack of desire to engage in the planning process. And so what's your advice or what's your process for dealing with that in holistic planning where it's kind of culturally against the idea of long-range planning or interactive planning in that way?
Would you say that's because of their relationship with the planning agencies, or are you saying it's some kind of worldview aspect?
It's both of those things. Of course, there's a lot of distrust and resentment towards
Right, right.
I don't think that's anything particularly new, at least from my perspective. But the thing that's new for me is to be working with an indigenous population that seems to be culturally doesn't align with the idea of people taking leadership roles and making decisions in the long term and setting objectives. It's more of a culture of harmony, subtle roles, and that's kind of against the process of planning where you're making decisions and moving forward.
Sure, sure. Certainly, I don't know that particular tribe situation. It is interesting that in Canada, some of the best examples of co-management are indigenous groups managing their own, whales and seals and hunting. And the Canadian government, Parks Canada, has, and again, this isn't the same necessarily historical baggage or issue that you're dealing with in Alaska, but years ago, they delegated a lot of that power, that decision, local, down to the local level. They set up large parameters and then let the indigenous folks determine what their maximum sustainable yield is. And, there's a lot of successful examples of that. We actually cite a few of them in our book. Maybe a better way to answer, or another way to answer, would come directly out of the dispute resolution field, because this is a very common scenario, not necessarily indigenous, but just everywhere in the world where you have historical distrust, oftentimes animosity, and you need to deal with that. And there's a number of different strategies that field uses. And again, I'm speaking from what I've observed, because one of our founding members is the Consensus Building Institute, and they specialize this in environment. We work a lot with them with national parks. As a matter of fact, my closest partner is working right now in Isle Royale because there's a big wilderness dispute there, but that might be getting off topic a little bit. So I'm not trained in dispute resolution, but I do know that another colleague there, one of the strategies that he uses, or they use in very virulent, dangerous situations. He was working in Honduras for a couple of years. You probably remember the assassinations of Berta Cáceres and previous other environmental activists there, where big oil palm producing companies and the local campesinos and the government, they were all killing each other. So how do you deal with that, which is probably even a more dire situation than what you have. But one strategy, and again, this is just one, is that you have a neutral outsider, a third party, agreed upon by all the major actors. And that's really important because it has to be a credible third party. And then, which in his case was the Consensus Building Institute, financed by the World Bank, because the World Bank had actually contributed to a lot of the problem. And then for 3 years, I think up to 3 years, he would go around meeting with the different actors and building trust on a one-to-one basis. He couldn't bring them all together because they would never have worked at the same table. So having all of these parallel, multiple one-on-one conversations, eventually moving them towards, based on the trust they have with that third party, agree on a certain set of basic conditions by which to meet. And they largely did that. That same process was also used in a forest reserve in Canada. Again, this is another example coming out of our book, where you had a lot of people who had fled the Vietnam War. You have indigenous folks, you have loggers, and they hated each other. And they did the exact same thing, that they ended up coming up with a forest management plan without actually ever bringing all the stakeholders together. So this is one strategy. Again, I don't know particulars of your situation. The example that I gave in Mineral de Pozos, the idea of co-creating from the beginning. Is there somebody in the community who has respect of the other community members, who has a different vision, who is able to meet with either a third party or with somebody, I don't know, from Clemson or the Park Service, with whom they have some relationship, and use that as a core to start having a dialogue and expanding outward by bringing additional people in, by having another strategies to achieve early gains. What do they call them? Early victories in the planning process, where you pick low-hanging fruit that doesn't take long to do. You achieve that, and it's a show of goodwill, and it's a show that change can actually happen. And then you work to larger, higher-hanging fruit and more difficult things, which might be the actual management plan itself, which is another. We sort of did that in Fire Island, where we were trying to engage new stakeholder groups like Latino in the Gateway, because the park had almost no Spanish speakers and had no experience dealing with them. So I speak Spanish, so we're able to break some ice by doing that, and offering a school program as part of it. Wasn't part of our terms of reference, but as something that we offered to do as a way to show goodwill towards that community. I don't know if that would be another applicable strategy. So anyway, there's a number of different strategies for bringing communities together, and I can certainly cite a couple books that the Consensus Building Institute has produced, which would give you a more in-depth answer, because I don't want to speak too far outside of my area. When we do have conflict situations like that, we call them in. Another lesson learned that I didn't mention in this talk over the past 3 or 4 years is that all park planning and all conservation management has a conflict component. And if you as a manager don't have some conflict resolution skills, you're going to be severely, well, not severely, it depends on the degree of conflict, of course, but you could be very severely handicapped in your ability to plan and bring your community together to participate in implementation. I mean, if there were no conflict, we wouldn't have very many of our management issues that we deal with, that we study at your program and mine.
Yeah, it's a tough issue. I'm just searching for tidbits of information that can help, so I appreciate your answer.
Sure. Yeah, but getting to yes, if you haven't seen that book, that's a classic in the field, and it's really small. It's only like 80 pages. It's this small. It comes out of the Harvard Negotiation Project, which works in all kinds of negotiation, but it's definitely a classic. Larry Susskind, who's the founder of Consensus Building Institute, and also holds positions at MIT and Harvard in their negotiation, wrote a famous book called, it's on my shelf around the corner. I can't remember the title, but if you're interested, I can send you that. But Larry Susskind, Susskind, is a real big name in that area.
Thank you.
Did you have another question? Okay, does anyone else have a question first? Okay, so I have one. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, don't get up.
Okay. All right, so I was just wondering, you said, as a general member, I'm aware that you have kind of different tiers of members, and I'm just wondering kind of what types of skills your active members and your board members and the people that go with you to work on these plans, what kind of skills and background do they have in order to help? I know that, for instance, one person is an expert in facilitation, I believe. I met with him when I was in Denver, so I'm just curious what else. What other skills?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, because if you look at planning from a holistic perspective and realize that really all disciplines come to bear in protected area management today, you're dealing with communities and technologies and conflict and psychology and sociology, really every discipline. Architecture, I'm finding more and more is really useful. For example, visitor management and interpretation. Every different field has something to contribute, because you can think holistically, but you can't be an expert in everything. And we're a volunteer organization. There's no paid staff. So certainly the first thing that we look for is enthusiasm and vision in people. But diversity in all senses. I mean, on our board, we've got a businessman who he's an advisor, sorry. Yeah, our chairman of the board is an expert in facilitation. You met him. He's one of the founders of the International Association of Facilitators. Another board member, which you just hired, is a Mexican woman professor who's an expert in archaeology and interpretation. Another is a professor in the University of Croatia, who's an expert in museology. We have architects, graphic designers who are associated, people who develop tourism, businessmen, or at least one business person. Another board member is a professor, actually not far from down the road from you. She's in University of North Carolina, Asheville, and she specializes in sacred sites and conservation. She's been very, very helpful. So, I mean, while we would love to have some more technical skilled people like a webmaster and someone to manage our online store, really, there's a place for everybody, because we have projects in different parts of the world, in different languages. I mean, I'm constant in communication with my colleagues back in Kenya. One of them is now the curator of the National Museum in Nairobi. But you never know when an opportunity comes up. And our approach is to have discussions, lots of dialogues with people before any project or any money even exists. So different languages. We want to have we have a research component ourselves, which would be maybe interesting to some of you. Besides this book, Steve and I finishing up a paper on applying authenticity to ROS, which will be going out not for review, but for submittal. We have another project that's stalled because we ran out of money on doing a condition-based zoning system to Costa Rican national parks rather than use-based, which is more of the traditional, conventional way of doing zoning. I've sponsored master's thesis in a Duke student, I guess also not far from you, relatively speaking, who did a master's thesis on management, protected areas, management plans in Honduran national parks. So in our think tank, we envision this think tank. We don't have funding for it yet, but we're working with a big NGO in Costa Rica and with the Wildlife Conservation Society, with one of our advisors who's a PhD, Jeremy Radachowski. And the idea is for it to be a semi-academic, but linked with doing that. What comes out of this think tank will then, by our partners, we'll actually try to implement them in the field. So there's definitely need for people with an academic. Right now, we're looking for someone to help us out to organize our publications and our conferences so that we can better network among, we've got quite a few academics in the consortium, but we don't know what conferences we're going to, and we don't know what we're publishing. And we need someone who's got enough understanding of academia and science to be able to help us bring order to that. And we'd love, a graduate student would be great for that. So there's really lots of different kinds of opportunities. And of course, if there's people with different skills that we don't have, that allows us to do things that we haven't done in the past.
Thank you.
Sure. I guess I have a hopefully a quick question. So I struggle with the idea of incrementalism when we talk about adaptive management or holistic planning, and particularly in relation to natural resources that should be stable over a longer term. So that's the advantage of the plus world, I think, as you're talking about, is that it provides that stability in resource conditions or planning over a long term instead of based on the whims of society. So what's your perspective on that strength of the plus world and weakness of the dice world?
Well, we certainly talk a lot about the theory of incremental planning in the book and its strengths and weaknesses. And one of the big weaknesses is what you point out, but the way to solve that problem is incrementalism applies. It's really a short-term vision approach, which is what you're criticizing, and rightfully so. To do any kind of planning, there should be a long-term vision. And even though we want to adapt, maybe we want to have version 2, release a new version of our plan every year, that doesn't mean our objectives are changing. That doesn't mean our long-term vision are changing. Matter of fact, they shouldn't. Otherwise, you're just chasing money. You're just in a rat race from one place to another. And like you said, there are different cycles. Well, you imply there are different cycles that operate on different scales. I mean, you cannot do year-to-year planning and manage a forest because you have to have a minimum cycle of 15 years. I mean, that's for forestry. Obviously, if you're talking about biodiversity, you're talking centuries in some cycles. So your vision and your objectives conform to those different time periods. But just because you're managing a 15-year harvesting cycle doesn't mean you can ignore all the politics around, doesn't mean you can ignore the squatters who are now taking pieces of your land. It doesn't mean you can ignore the forest fires that are now eating into your profits. If you happen to live in a situation where you really don't have a lot of urgent issues, then the urgency to produce new versions is far less. I remember, and this is always a favorite example, when I was at the in Bariloche, Argentina in 2007 was the Latin American Parks Congress, and what's his name? Kenton Miller, one of the great national park minds, was still alive then, and I don't remember what I had asked him. I got to meet him. He died a couple of years later. He gave an example of a park in Argentina that had a management plan of 1 page, and he said it only had one management action in this page. The entire management plan was just one action, and that was every year to fly over the park, which is a glacier, and just see that everything was okay. And if everything was the same, then that's all you had to do year in and year out. And I was like, wow, that's a good example of, your plan doesn't need to be any bigger or more frequent than the conditions allow. I imagine now with the glaciers melting at a much more accelerated pace, since he told me that in 2006, there might be several more management actions in that plan.
Yeah, so you're saying keep the big picture stable and have variability or the ability to adapt or change continuously in the actions.
I'm saying have a long-range vision of where you want to go and have longer range objectives. They can't be written in stone, but you can't rewrite them every year either. And the incremental, what does that mean? I mean, in practical terms, having a new updated plan every year. Now, if you don't have big changes in your site, then that doesn't necessarily imply a lot of work. If you do have big changes and you don't do the update, then you're damning it to being outdated and useless in a short period of time. And we have only tens of thousands of examples of that around the world. So you don't need to continue repeating that process.
Thank you.
Problem is, oftentimes parks, because of legislation, are required to have 10 or 20 different plans. They're legally required. So, how does a manager, and I don't have a good answer to this, how does a manager allocate their attention, let alone financial resources, to maintaining 10 or 20 plans up to date? I mean, you can't do that. Maybe you have to just prioritize. And that paradigm of having so many different thematic plans may also need to change. But I haven't dealt with that issue as much.
All right. Thank you so much, Does anyone else have any last questions? All right. Well, thank you so much, John. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you guys for the invitation.
All right, of course, and I will be in touch soon, just as a little follow-up.
Excellent. Yes, you've allowed me to show myself that I can do this as a webinar version. Your thoughts, though, I mean,